Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording here to share with you my approach and how I use sidechaining within my heavy mixes. Now, just recently, a viewer commented on one of my videos asking about how I'm using sidechaining on my kick and bass to make room for my bass guitar when my kick drum is playing while the bass guitar is playing at the same time. And to be honest with you, I rarely use sidechain compression in this way in order to make room for other instruments. Now, once in a blue moon, I will use sidechain compression on my bass guitar being triggered from my kick if it's a super duper mechanical song, like maybe an electronic style metal song or even like a really extreme djent production, but that's the exception, that's not the rule. Me personally, the only real sidechaining I use in my mixes is when I open the gate on my live snare drum tracks being triggered from a snare trigger. Now, this might sound confusing if you're not used to mixing live drums, but that's why I've put this video together to show you exactly how I'm using sidechaining in this capacity in my mixes. So I have a mix here with all live drums. Let's check it out, then I'm gonna dive deep and explain to you and show you exactly how I'm using sidechaining in this drum mix. Let's check it out. So in this mix, these are all live drums. The only thing I have mixed in is I have a snare sample mixed in with the snare drum. I also have a kick drum sample, but the samples are not samples I've taken from some library. They were actually taken from the kit itself that I recorded when I recorded this track about a month ago. And because they were taken from the kit themselves, they blend nicely in with the live mics. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning the snare sample is what's opening the gate on my live snare drum. Now I'm gonna solo my live snare drum here, and let's hear what the live snare sounds like on its own. As you can hear, a little bit of cymbal bleed on the tail end of the hits. I also have a snare bottom mic mixed in as well, so let me introduce that and hear what that sounds like. So you can clearly hear that the snare drum is gated. You know, a lot of the bleed is eliminated, especially the cymbal bleed. And the way I'm doing it in such a clean manner without the gate being mistriggered, because as you know, when mixing live drums, if you just have a gate being triggered by the original signal, it'll often mistrigger by the kick drum bleed that's being introduced into the snare mic, sometimes the cymbal bleed, sometimes bleed from the toms. And what you're hearing here is 100% clean and 100% accurate, because the gates on both the tracks are being triggered by this track, which is the snare sample. And let's take a listen to the snare sample. Now, the snare sample sounds pretty much exactly like the live snare track, except with no cymbal bleed at all, because it is literally the exact same snare drum that you're hearing. At the end of the session, when I record a band, I will always take clean samples of each of the drummer's drums, just in case I need them in a mix. And in this mix, I'm just blending in a snare sample ever so slightly with the live snare for a little more consistency, and also to use it as a tool to open up the gate on my live snare track. So the way I have this set up is super simple, and you can do this within any DAW. I have a send on my snare sample track, and if you look here, it's called Snare Key, right? And I have it set pre-fader, so no matter what level I have my fader set in my drum mix as far as my snare sample is concerned, the level is 100% the same, or at 0 dB, however I decide to set it, that's being sent to my live snare track. And it's not necessarily being sent to the live snare track, it's actually being sent to the live snare gate. So I have a gate engaged on my live snare track, like I mentioned before, but the signal it's actually seeing or hearing is coming from the actual sample, not from the live snare itself. So for example here, just to show you, I'm gonna solo both my snare top mic and my snare bottom mic. If I bypass the send on my snare sample in the middle of the drums playing, you won't hear any live snare at all. as you can see, when I bypass that send, all of a sudden there's no live snare drum because the gate is not seeing any signal and it's not reacting to any input signal because it's not receiving any input signal at all. So the question is, why am I jumping through all of these hoops? Now in reality, it's actually really simple, but if you're a beginner, this might seem overwhelming, but believe me, it's really simple. But let me demonstrate now why I'm doing this in the first place. I'm gonna go to my snare bottom track. I'm gonna keep my gate engaged, but I'm not gonna be using the sidechain. Okay, so here it is, it's switched over to channel. So now my snare bottom is receiving input signal coming from the actual channel itself, meaning the actual microphone on my snare bottom. Now let's listen to the actual bleed that's introduced when set to this setting versus using the sidechain. Let's check it out. So as you can hear, there's a little more kick drum bleed introduced. And that's because we have to remember that all different frequencies, all different spill is being introduced into that snare bottom mic. And it's very difficult to pinpoint and try and get it to open only on the snare. You could do it with a sidechain EQ and things like that, but it's much easier, in my opinion, to just use the snare sample. Even if you're not even using a snare sample in the mix, it's just less work that you end up having to do in the long run. So again, I'm gonna re-engage the sidechain and have my snare bottom gate only reading signal from the snare sample, and listen to how nice and clean it is. Yeah, it's also great because when the drummer's playing lighter hits, you can make sure that the gate is being opened on those hits. If I were gating my snare drum in a more traditional way, a lot of times those ghost notes will be missed and sometimes will be cut out. But then if I have my gate set to allow those ghost notes, there'll be too much bleed coming from the cymbals, toms, and kick drum. And I also want to say this, if you dig the guitar tone that you hear in this sample, you could download the exact same impulse responses that I'm using, and the impulse response pack that you're downloading also includes an additional 6 IRs for a total of 8 IRs. You'll get impulse responses of 2 SM57s, 2 SM81s, as well as a Sennheiser E609 and an Electro Voice RE16. Now in this mix, I'm using the SM57 number 1 and SM57 number 2, but like I said, you have 6 other awesome impulse responses to choose from to use within your own productions, and you can download the impulse response pack for absolutely free. There's a link below in this video's description. So there you have it. That's how I use sidechaining in my mixes. 99.9% of the time, it's used to open gates being triggered by maybe a snare sample or MIDI or just some other clean source that's nice and controlled so I can control the bleed on my drums in my heavy mixes. So I'm curious to know, how do you use sidechaining in your mixes? Or is it something that you haven't gotten to yet and you're just currently learning about? Leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload little weekly videos on all things Metal Rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, got t-shirts, mugs, and a ton of other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store in this video's description. And again, if you dug the guitar tone you heard in this video, you could download the exact same impulse responses that I'm using. There's a link below to my guitar impulse response Octapack in this video's description. Just click on the link and the impulse response pack is all yours for absolutely free. And until next time, happy mixing.